India and China Conflict 2020. A brief introduction about FIDS is FIDS is a US-based think tank and works for US-India relationship, India and Indian diaspora related policy issues. FIDS is a forum for policy analysis and awareness for India and Indian diaspora related to social, political issues and policy matters and world affairs. FIDS has centers in Washington, D.C., New York, Silicon Valley, and Atlanta. With the introduction of FIDS, I would like to introduce Mr. Khanderao Khan and hand it over to him for this session. So Khanderao is a policy analyst on international issues and policy matters related to India, especially related to AFPAC region, India, China, and Indo-US relationships. So he has hosted conferences, events, and talks, and written various articles related to India-China issues. He was also a convener of India-China conference in 2012 in Washington, D.C. That was about 50 years of India-China war from conflict to collaboration, the war of 1962. He has published articles on India-China standoff on Doklam, South China Sea, and which was published in Far Observer and India Abroad. So with this, I would like to pass over to Mr. Khanderao.
Thanks, Kiran, and thanks, Ashwin, for hosting this. We are very fortunate to have this STEAM panel today. So this is our third session on India-China issues. Particularly, first one was in June 5th. Second was July 10th, and now this is the third. Today we have Professor Walter Andersen, Jeff Smith, and Nitin Gokhale, who have joined from India. So the format of today's session is that initially I will invite each of the panelists to give their opening statement. Afterwards, we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll open forum for the question answer. So first, let me set a stage for the today's discussion. As we know that the whole world, when it was busy during the COVID-19, Chinese incursion started in India around May. The report started coming. And Indian forces started dealing on the border incursions, particularly in there are four spots: Pangong River, Pangong Lake, Galwan River, Hot Spring, and some other in the Despang land also. And there were while the first commander level discussion was concluded in the first week of June, and that the de-escalation was agreed, but still again the Chinese forces, particularly in Galwan River, came at LSE, and there was a fight on 15th of June. It was one of the bloodiest fight after almost 5 decades. Actually, the last fight was 1967, Nathula Pass, where almost 80 Indian and 340 Chinese soldiers died. And in Galwan River, 20 Indian and reportedly 43 Chinese soldiers were died. And this also ended a bloodless or bloodless unease between these two countries for last 4 decades. There has been time to time standoff, like say 2013 there was a standoff in Despang, then 2017 at Doklam, and time to time even 2019 after the August 5th 370 abolition, there was also some it wasn't escalated as much, but this is almost in the decades has been unparalleled. So we'll start with this context. So currently, after Modi's visit in Ladakh on 3rd of July, and then subsequently the discussion between India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval and the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, there were agreement on the de-escalation, and that de-escalation or disengagement is in progress. So this is the context that we'll be having today's discussion. This is the right time to look at why this happened, what is the context, what are the next we can expect from this. I would like to welcome Professor Walter Andersen. As you may know him, he is one of the prominent scholar on South Asia studies. He has been in John Hopkins University, and he has been visiting professor in Tongji University in China. He has spent a significant time in India and China, so he has the pretty much good handle on the ground realities. He also authored books, 2 books, and he was also in State Department uh, as a political analyst. So let me welcome Professor Walter Andersen.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the Foundation for India and Indian Studies to host this meeting on what is a very critical topic. And that is the impact of the incursions on Sino-Indian relations. I'm sure all of you have been looking at the news the last few days and also imagery that has appeared specifically in India Today, the most recent issue of India Today, which shows that the Chinese in a few places in Ladakh have halted the disengagement to pre-April positions that had been agreed upon at the recent Corps commanders meeting between the two sides, and have forces on Indian territory. The number of forces is somewhat varying, but that they have forces and also equipment of various kinds on the Indian traditional claim line. In my view, it's questionable, given all of this, if the Indian perceive the disengagement agreement to be disengagement at all, to be quite frank. But I think it's a tactical maneuver. And it is a tactical maneuver in support of a strategic goal of making India and its neighbors wary of potential retaliation by a militarily stronger China somewhere along the long Himalayan border. Similar assertiveness has been applied to other Asian neighbors as well, I think, with the same message in mind. The future of Sino-Indian relations, in my view, ultimately depends on the foreign policy goals of President Xi, and to a certain extent also on US policy in the Indo-Pacific area. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes more and briefly. Given China's unusually aggressive approach toward a broad range of foreign policy issues regarding its neighbors over the past several months, we must ask if China is abandoning foreign policy goals, principles such as maintaining a stable security environment, and through a generally cautious approach to foreign policy problems, and carefully calibrating China's foreign policy when it overreaches. This was certainly the case when I taught in China, and I was last there about a year ago, teaching about India in China. China now seems to have entered a new phase by pushing for hegemony in East Asia, perhaps with the goal of emulating the US power as a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. I say this because many of my Chinese colleagues at Tongji and Fudan also would talk about the goal of having a situation in which China was the recognized hegemon in East Asia, recognized by the US specifically, and the Chinese in turn would recognize, as they do now, they say, as the hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. I think this is at least an intermediate goal that they have. So with this goal in mind, China wants to reduce, if not eliminate, a US security presence in the Indo-Pacific region. And part of that effort seems to be preventing Asian powers from either working together or cooperating closely with the US, the only country with the power to effectively block Chinese domination. China seems to be implementing its goals of dominance by openly going on the offensive against its neighbors in a bid, I think, to make them wary of Chinese power. Commenting on this aggressiveness in a quote that many of you may have seen in an article that he wrote. Former State Department Secretary Kurt Campbell wrote, "We may be, quote, getting a first sense of what a truly assertive Chinese foreign policy looks like when critical decisions are increasingly made by one person, the president," end quote. At the same time that President Xi is exerting Chinese power, we're also witnessing a backlash of public anger and national policy against China, something that is opposite, I think, from what the Chinese leadership had expected. As a consequence, there's growing public support among China's neighbors to strengthen military capabilities at home and to work out security cooperation with each other and with the US. The Philippines, for example, recently pulled back on its demands that American forces vacate the country, and its somewhat tense relations with China recently is, I think, behind that. Another example is the revived support for military cooperation among the so-called Quad states, India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. With growing anti-China sentiment in the US, Washington has voiced very strong support for India regarding the Ladakh tensions. And this builds on a growing US-India defense security relationship as represented by the 2019 Tiger Triumph military exercises involving, for the first time, all three branches of the militaries of India and the United States. This support for India is one of the few issues at the national level in which there is bipartisan support between Republicans and Democrats. The intention of backing India as an Asian counterweight to China became clear even earlier in 2005 decision of the Bush administration, effectively to accept India as a nuclear weapons state. The two sides, however, have stopped short of a defense alliance in order to maintain strategic ambiguity, and I think this works to India's advantage in its relationship with China. The Modi government up to now has been very careful and to mute its criticism of Chinese assertiveness. Prime Minister has worked very hard to build a personal relationship with President Xi, meeting with him 18 times since coming to office, more than with any other national leader. But that effort clearly has not worked, and senior government officials in India are becoming increasingly blunt, especially since the June 15th killing of 20 Indian soldiers. There's also greater Indian willingness to talk openly about a closer relationship with the United States. At the July 22nd US-India Business Summit, for example, Prime Minister Modi reiterated Prime Minister Vajpayee's earlier claim that the US and India are, quote unquote, natural partners. A proposal echoed at the summit by Secretary of State Pompeo, who underscored US commitment to India by inviting it to the next G7 meeting and to support the revival of the Quad, which I talked about a few minutes ago. As part of India's move to reset its relationship with China, it is likely to limit Chinese involvement in infrastructure, high technology, and to make an effort to reduce its dependence on China for a wide variety of products and IT applications. And in fact, as you know, it's already begun to do that. But at the same time, neither India nor the US has called rightly, in my view, for the kind of close security relationship that exists between the US and Japan. This preserves room for maneuver for India to get even closer to the US should Chinese threats grow. And is this potential, I think, that may be one of the major reasons China has agreed to engage in Ladakh. But its partial disengagement at the same time remains a standing warning that Big Brother is there to exploit advantages along the long Himalayan frontier. Over the short run, the stability of the Himalayan frontier, in my view, requires a committed Indian military presence and making it clear to China that India will not, quote unquote, sacrifice an inch of territory, as the Indian defense minister recently stated. In the long run, however, it will be very difficult to get China to vacate property that it has occupied, made more difficult that some of this territory is in areas where India and China have contesting claims. What the Prime Minister probably meant by not sacrificing an inch is that no additional Chinese nibbling on the Indian claim line of the line of actual control will be tolerated. India, meanwhile, is building up its military capacity and infrastructure at the border to forestall any future incursions. And the Modi government has made clear it will push back against any such action. Over the longer run, India will need significantly to build up its economy to make itself a realistic counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific region. But for this tactical objective to be meaningful, the US has to be prepared to push back on Chinese assertiveness, as only the US has the military and economic to stand up to China, whose economy and military remains the largest in Asia, and that advantage is likely to grow even more. At the present, Chinese assertiveness is the linchpin that nudges the two democracies closer together, and China's continued effort to implement President Xi's goal of Chinese domination in at least East Asia is likely to prompt India and the US to work more closely with each other, whoever wins the next presidential election. India is also likely to work harder to convince its neighbors that a democratic India is a better source of stability and security than an authoritarian China. This, I think, is going to require Indian moves to integrate the South Asian states economically and to put more effort into that than it has recently. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Walter Anderson. You have covered a wide territory. You have rightly raised some questions, I think, that would give a context for a wider panel discussion, whether the disengagement is full, complete, whether China, what the intentions are. But without naming about the Chinese dream of middle kingdom, you have touched base the hegemonic approach that China has. I feel that it is not just in South Asia, but it's actually during various these BRI initiatives and others. It is also reaching to South African region. So it is not much to one continent. It's a dream of getting much more wider, it seems to be. You have rightly covered the shift in stance of Indian foreign ministry officials. I think they are getting much more blunt or bold. The impact of this particularly shift in Indian thinking on the reliance of on China, that also is quite a bit visible. Huawei is being reconsidered on the 5G spectrum, as you may see that. So definitely this is a, you have covered a wider territory, so we'll discuss later in the panel discussion. I would like to welcome now Jeff Smith. Jeff Smith is a senior research fellow from Heritage Foundation, a prominent think tank from Washington, DC. He is a leading expert on South Asia, particularly on India-China matters. He has written two books, one Cold Peace, which is about India-China rivalry, and also China's quest for the rise. I welcome Jeff Smith.
Thank you for having me, Kondarab. This was a very timely discussion. And, not for the first time, I agree with a lot of what Walter said and how he framed the current standoff and geopolitical dynamics. Frankly, he was able to cover a lot of ground. I'll just make a few points to contribute to what was already said. I do think that in many ways, this crisis at the LAC was a paradigm shifting moment. There are frequent crises at the LAC. In fact, they've been growing in frequency in recent years. And I think this is an important point. It had appeared as if the LAC was becoming more stable and more manageable for many years, beginning with a series of important agreements that were signed in 1993, 1996, 2003, 2005, to manage the border dispute. And the last agreement of which was the Border Defense Cooperation Agreement signed in 2013. But momentum behind actually resolving this border dispute has been stalled since around 2007. And it's ironic that the last agreement signed to manage the border dispute was in 2013, because since 2013, we have seen not just the transgressions of the LAC that result from differing perceptions, of which India records several hundred a year, but we've seen an escalation of these standoffs. You've seen these multi-week crises beginning in 2013 in Ladakh. There was another one in 2014. There was a smaller one in 2015. Then there was the unprecedented crisis on the Doklam Plateau in 2017. And now an even more unprecedented crisis in Ladakh in 2020. The first deadly encounter at the border in over 45 years. And on top of that, last year, India recorded the most transgressions of the LAC that I've ever seen, over 600. And so it's all a sign that something isn't working. Things are getting worse. Things are getting more volatile at the LAC. China is getting more adventurous. It is willing to accept more risk. I think that's one of the key takeaways of the last few months, is that we've been seeing assertive Chinese behavior across multiple fronts: Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, South China Sea, of course with India. And in each case, it's signaling that it is willing to accept more risk. It's willing to accept the possibility that it's pushing its neighbors closer to the US, that it's creating a blowback, that it may create this sort of balancing coalitions that are really the one thing most likely to undermine its rise, frankly. And it doesn't care. It's prepared, it's willing to deal with those consequences in order to assert itself on its national interests. This is wolf warrior diplomacy in action. And the question is, are they right, or have they overplayed their hand? And that's going to depend on how we respond, frankly. And if I were in Delhi, I've argued this in the past, there's a saying about turning a crisis into an opportunity. And there's no question that the Chinese are making some tactical moves at the line of actual control, maybe even winning some tactical positions at the line of actual control. But these, again, are tactical victories, and in my opinion, don't actually change the military balance along the line of actual control, the greater military balance. So it's a limited victory for the Chinese. The strategic issues, I think, are much more important, and the question of India's alignment in the 21st century with the US, the question of how India views China as a threat, as an opportunity, as a partner, or as an adversary, these are big strategic issues and questions that will shape the future of geopolitics this century. And so if I'm sitting in India, I'm looking at ways to turn this tactical victory for the Chinese into a strategic benefit for myself, to reassess who my real allies are and who my real enemies are. And I would argue that continuing to pretend that China was a friend would have done more damage over the long term than allowing them to occupy, a few acres or kilometers of territory at Pangong Lake that was a gray zone previously anyway. So if you want to turn this crisis into an opportunity, though, you have to follow through. And I think India has already taken some decisions that have imposed costs on the Chinese. The app ban on 59 Chinese apps was significant. I think the likelihood that India is not going to allow Huawei into its 5G networks is significant. It doesn't matter that the revenues for these companies was fairly modest. That wasn't their principal goal, was earning money right away. It was gaining market share, gaining market research, and frankly, collecting data. If you want to know how to impose costs on China, you have to find out what they want. And they want data. They want access to telecommunications networks, even if it comes at a financial cost to them. And so I think the app decision and probably the eventual Huawei decision will impose costs on China. But there are other moves that the Indian government is taking its time on, like inviting Australia into Malabar, on how to proceed with the Quad. And I understand there are delicate negotiations currently ongoing with the Chinese, and some of these will take a bit longer to unfold. But they will determine, I think, how India comes out of this crisis and whether it reaps some strategic benefit from the tactical moves being made at the LAC. And I think I'll just kind of end on this note. I think it's also an opportunity to reassess the partnership with the US and to re-examine maybe some of the myths that were associated with what this partnership with the US might bring. You know, I've been watching this for 10 to 15 years, and at every step of the way, there were voices of dissent inside India suggesting that this partnership with the US will hurt our interests. You know, we can't sign these military cooperation agreements with the US because then we'll just become a subservient power and America will force us into its conflicts and it will be colonialism all over again. And these are all secretive ways for America to establish dominance over India and undermine its interests. And I would ask those critics, now that we're, 10 or 15 years in, have those fears and criticisms borne true? We've now signed multiple military interoperability agreements, joint vision statements for the Indo-Pacific. We're much more closely integrated than many of us believed was possible a decade ago. And have those predictions borne out? Or has this partnership been quite beneficial to both India and the US? Has it brought us closer together? Has America been a reliable partner? Did the US provide support to India at Balakot, at Pulwama, on the Belt and Road Initiative, on Article 370, on sanctioning Pakistani-based terrorists, on the nuclear suppliers group, on the LAC crisis? Has America been a good partner or not? And so I think this is an opportunity to really take this crisis as an opportunity to step back and really reevaluate and reassess questions of alignment with the US and also questions of China as a strategic challenge.
Thanks, Jeff. You have wonderfully covered some of the key aspects. Most importantly, I think you have noted this is a paradigm shift. So India's thinking, not just a military level, but also economic and how India positions, how India sees China, whether China is a partner or adversary. All these things are definitely going to be important, and also it is going to impact Indo-US relations in this area as well as South China Sea. I think this is a good point of discussion we can carry later in the panel. I would like to now welcome Nitin Gokhale. Nitin Gokhale is a leading security and strategic affairs expert from India. He's founder of Bharat Shakti and Strat News Global. It has very good traction. His coverage, particularly on these military aspects, are widely well received. He engaged in policy discussions and also has understanding about the ground realities. He has written almost, I think, 7 books covering military history, insurgencies, and also the wars. Let me welcome Nitin Gokhale.
Thank you, Khandarao. In fact, it's a pleasure to be on this channel. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Walter Andersen and Jeff, who one has been reading and hearing for such a long time on China and South Asia. And of course, it's morning in the US, but it's late evening in India. And just to update all of you, there was one more meeting of the WMCC, the Working Mechanism on Consultation and Coordination between India and China. And they have continued to discuss the issue on the border and have now decided to have one more round of Corps Commanders talks sometime next week, because one contentious issue still remains, and that is at the gray area of finger 4 and finger 8, between finger 4 and finger 8, just to give you that update. But I'm not going to spend time on the tactical 100 meters here or 8 kilometers there, kind of ups and downs that have been happening for the past couple of months. But I want to look at the larger context of the India-China relationship, which particularly since 2004 and 5 had shown an upward graph in various sectors, but the strategic relationship. And that old normal has vanished. Thanks to the LAC crisis, the trust has been demolished. Whatever carefully built edifice of cooperation and competition, which was spoken by former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, I think in 2006, where he said that there is enough space for China and India to grow, and we need not be adversaries, but we can cooperate and also have competition wherever possible. I think that normal, the old normal, has vanished. The new normal, we don't know what will it be. But the fact is that India has woken up. Indian decision makers, the scales on their eyes, if they were there, have fallen. Because this is a wake-up call to not just the decision makers, but also to the entire country and the citizens. The kind of response that one gets and the kind of curiosity that one has from common citizens, common viewers and readers is unprecedented. So in one fell swoop, China has made 1.3 billion Indians their enemy for at least the next 20-25 years by what they did at Galwan. Not so much the multiple pressure points that they tried to create at the friction points along the line of actual control in Ladakh, but by what they did, the perfidy and the sabotage that they tried at Galwan. And it's also true in reverse, I would think, that the loss of lives on the Chinese side, and the numbers have varied as we know that the Chinese never release the numbers of the fatalities or fatal casualties on their side. Notwithstanding that we don't know what the numbers are, the fact is for the first time in 41 years, the Chinese have faced death or have sort of experienced death of their soldiers. They're not used to the bloodshed that Indian soldiers and Indian army is. And the ripples of that Galwan clash, the tactical or a sub-tactical battle, I think is going to be in the long run more strategic, because the Chinese tactics of nibbling and putting pressure and then going 2 steps forward and 1 step backward has the bluff has been called of that tactic at the border. Because now, if they thought India will succumb and roll over, that hasn't happened. And if you really look back after 1962, military pressure hasn't really worked on India. And I'm surprised that the Chinese tried this once more. You recall 1967, you recall 1987, and the subsequent 3 or 4 standoffs that Jeff spoke about since 2013 have shown that the military pressure doesn't work. Ultimately, the Chinese have to sit down and have talks to resolve these standoffs. And that's exactly what is happening even here. I think the speed and response, the speed of response and the kind of resolute pushback that the Indian soldiers and the Indian army showed at various friction points has surprised the Chinese, and they'll have to reassess what their tactics and strategy would be. Why did they do it? There are 2 reasons I feel, and I may be completely wrong. One, of course, is the larger framework where they're putting pressure on all the disputed areas from Japan to Bhutan and in between in India and Philippines, I would say, or Indonesia, but also to test their own troops and their own armies after the transformation that they have tried to effect in the Chinese military. And as a subsidiary fallout of that deployment, the Chinese wanted to map what would India's response be, where would they bring the forces, readiness that India has. I think they are mapping this. And I suspect that this is not the end of coercion tactics that China has adopted. I think they will come back with a bigger force maybe in a year's time. And I think it's a wake up call that was needed in India because otherwise there was a tendency to regard the LAC as manageable. And therefore, long term strategies were not evolving in dealing with China militarily. And I'm glad that not just militarily, but India is responding in other sectors too. And I think the multi-pronged strategy that has been adopted now to restrict financial investments in India's startup companies and unicorns, also to restrict investment from China in power sector. Of course, Huawei, Jeff spoke about. It's now more or less a given that Huawei and ZTE will have no access to the Indian markets, which I think will hurt the Chinese in the long run more than loss of 20 or 40 soldiers on the LAC. And the restrictions put on Chinese investments in various other sectors is going to hurt the Chinese much more than in the medium term at least, if not in the long term, that we will see how it sort of pans out. But what the Chinese have done in one stroke is to make India aware of their perfidy, their nature, I mean, their distrustful nature of the relationship that should have been noticed by the Indian decision makers as well as the people, and have made, I think, India and the Indian military more resolute. Uh, Remember, the frequency of standoffs on the LAC have increased because India is now managing to reach the LAC much faster than ever before. And I think the Chinese had the head start, of course, for 10 years at least since 2000. But India is fast playing catch up, and that is giving India the ability to respond much faster, much more resolutely. Whether the small tactical gains and small tactical losses that will be calculated at the end of this standoff can be offset in the medium term will have to be seen. But this entire strategy of Xi Jinping to alter the status quo, and I have no doubt that this entire operation of multiple friction points to be created and massive deployment in Aksai Chin had the sanction at the highest level from the CMC, is not going to play out. It's not going to get dividends that they were looking for. And I think, therefore, the loser in the medium and long term is going to be China, because if they have to manage their relationship or fraught relationship with the US, at least the Chinese needed the India border to be quieter. In one go, it has pushed, the Chinese have pushed India closer to the US, but I still doubt whether India will ever become a treaty ally of the US. It suits both Washington, DC and New Delhi not to have any treaty alliance, and yet cooperate much more closely, much more deeper in all spheres, especially in sharing intelligence and have military cooperation in various sectors across the three services. I think the Chinese have overreached, they have miscalculated, and Xi Jinping has overreached 10 years too early, is what I would say at the end of my remarks. And then, of course, we can discuss the other questions if I have left out anything. But again, thank you very much for this opportunity. Andera?
Thanks, Nitin. You called a very different perspective, which is important to highlight. It seems that China got surprised by both preparedness and response from India. And it's India is, or it could be also the you touch base on the rationale or the why this might be happening. That is another discussion I would like to start in the beginning, that why China has, what is the timing, what is the rationale behind it, whether it's overplayed, whether it was just testing. Sometime back, Walter Andersen, if you remember, a couple of months back when we had the first session, you had mentioned that it could be because the internal dynamics in China that President Xi Jinping is facing, which Nitin also touched base, whether that is causing this one, or it doesn't seems to be just that on the India LAC region, but also South China Sea, when particularly timing is also interesting when the whole world is almost like a pause because of coronavirus. uh, China has started incursion when it would have been a kind diplomatically much more to establish global relations and goodwill back, which is kind of deficit. But instead of that, there is an aggressive stance happening. And this time, as Jeff and Nitin both said, that this doesn't seems to be very localized clashes. It opened at 4 different hotspots. And also the timing. The timing I'm focusing more because 1950, when China entered, when the Korean War was happening, at the time China entered into Tibet. In 1962, when Cuban crisis was in progress and whole world's attention was between US and Russia, what would unfold. At the same time, China entered attack India. And now the whole world's attention in general, and India in particular, was in the lockdown situation. This incursion happened. Even if you look at the during the Kargil war, during that time, that the Pangong Lake, that the whole 8 kilometer road, actually major portion of that was built during that time when India was actually focused on a Kargil war. So China seems to be much more getting aggressive, and the timing is very serious in this case. So with this note, I wanted to ask the question to panelists that what is the main reason behind this aggression and timings? There were also some discussions around Article 370 and covering the Ladakh as a separate union territory. So can we talk about that? We can start with probably Professor Walter, because he had initially commented on that. And Jeff, also in last time your discussion, you had mentioned about the same thing. So let's start with the reason behind this Chinese aggression and the timing of it.
Well, we have to logic here because China is in many ways a closed society where you do not get debate on issues openly, certainly debate that involves disagreement. And you don't have interviews with major foreign policy makers, so it has to be somewhat of a guess. And, you know, just logically, there are a couple of reasons. One is the more short-term one of taking advantage of the pandemic in the sense that, you know, the world is sort of focused internally on doing that at this time, and including the US, which also has a national election coming up. So there's that. But I think that there's also strategic issues involved, which was kind of the core of what I talked about. I think that the president of China has a view of China, maybe to use the old phrase, middle kingdom role, but asserting itself on the world stage, certainly in Asia and certainly in East Asia, where I think it does anticipate becoming the hegemonic power and wants others to recognize that as such. I don't think that's going to go away. I don't think President Xi has any intention of moving away from that goal. Whatever has happened in India or anywhere else, I think that is his goal. And I think he will continue to push for that in one way or the other. I think that, you know, the timing may have had something to do with sort of grumbling in China regarding the Chinese government's handling of the pandemic and some other issues as well, economy that has declined. One has to remember, in the Chinese context, the Communist Party, in a sense, made a bargain with the people. We'll provide you growing economic opportunities and advantages. You give us full power. Well, whenever the economic opportunities is in decline, that other part of the equation becomes real. And I can tell you from having been in China and reading some of the email traffic that's there, there's a lot of discussion about inadequacies in the government. As you can imagine, a large government that has a lot of inefficiency, and one only has to live there to realize the extent of the inefficiencies and corruption that exists. And, you know, people are aware of that. And so I think, you know, the government was aware of that. But there's another issue here is that, you know, China operates in a bubble. Are they truly aware of the extent of the disagreements and the anger of other countries? Every embassy has a party secretary. Every part of Chinese society has a party secretary. Nothing really goes out without the approval of the party secretary. And I'm wondering whether the various embassies are letting the government know what the real reaction is to what's happening. I have a doubt, to be quite frank, whether that's the case. Having worked in the government myself, I know there's often an effort to do things and say things that you know the leadership wants to hear. We have less of that here, though we have an element of that here too, I should say. But certainly in China, you have much more of that. And I don't know whether they're really getting a true sense of what the real feeling is. But whatever, I don't see this situation, I don't see them backtracking on this situation anytime soon.
Yeah.
So Jeff, what do you think that is it some much more internal dynamics that is causing, or it is also India's preparation on like say DBO road and infrastructure development, or also the 370? There were some thoughts about that also. So can you please cover that?
Well, with the same proviso that Walter offered, you know, the answer is we don't know. If anybody tells you they know exactly why China did what it did, they're probably lying to you. All we're left to do is make educated guesses and use informed analysis. And so that said, my interpretation, my best guess, is that the timing of the crisis and China's conduct in the crisis is the product of two complementary trends. One is that there has been a game of cat and mouse taking place along the line of actual control for many years now. And China has consistently drawn from the same playbook, which is when India is engaged in infrastructure construction near the LAC that they are uncomfortable with, they protest and they object. And on occasion, they launch incursions across the LAC, set up shop, and cause a political crisis, and hope that in that political crisis, India agrees to withdraw some of the recently constructed infrastructure. This happened in 2013, in 2014, and 2015. And so I suspect India's completion of the DS-DBO road last year and its attempt this year to build feeder roads out to outposts even closer to the LAC were a major part of the motivation for China to launch some kind of crisis at the border, to make some move at the border. I am not as convinced that Article 370, which did not in any way change India's external claims in Aksai Chin, along the Ladakh border, the Shaksgam Valley, they had no effect on India's external claims, really. They just resulted in a restatement of India's claims there. I'm a little skeptical that this was a major motivation. I think it's more of a convenient excuse. But it is possible to imagine that in China, they viewed these two things, the completion of the DS-DBO road, the upgrading of infrastructure, and the Article 370 decision, all as part of the same effort for India to consolidate control over parts of Ladakh and improve its position and strengthen its position. And the Chinese don't like that. The problem that they have, of course, is that by mostly universal consensus, these activities were taking place on India's side of the line of actual control. And so China is not going to get any sympathy from the international community and does not stand on firm ground in telling India what it can and cannot do on its own territory. So I think there's this localized LAC issue that has a history that was partly responsible for what happened. I think that is also fed into and been aggravated by this larger push of Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy and assertiveness post-pandemic. So I think we likely would have seen some kind of incursion in response to the LAC activities, but maybe not multiple incursions at Gogra, Hot Springs, maybe not an effort to seize this gray zone at Pangong Lake, maybe not a separate dust up in Sikkim, maybe not a deadly clash, at Galwan, or an effort to move artillery to the border, which we haven't really seen before. So I think the crisis is a product of this localized LAC game of cat and mouse, where the Chinese are drawing from this familiar playbook, but that playbook is on steroids this time, and they're acting much more aggressively this time because of the pandemic and the wolf warrior diplomacy and this toxic cocktail of Chinese nationalism. And you take the two trends together and you have the crisis.
Thanks,
But
Jeff.
that's just a guess, my friend.
Yeah, I know that, but definitely you are bringing that the Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy getting much more aggressive and taking opportunity of this pandemic. I wanted to listen from Nitin. What is the insider view from India? Particularly, Modi ji visited China for rather the meetings with Chinese presidents and officials almost like say more than a dozen times, and there were a lot of efforts to have a better relations, particularly based on the economic development. And when this happened, what's the insider view from India that you would like to outline?
Well, my friend, I have to disappoint you. I do not have an insider view because I'm not inside the government or in the party. But my own educated guess is twofold. One is that Prime Minister Modi has tried this playbook with both Pakistan and China ever since he came to power. He extended the hand of friendship with Pakistan right at the beginning, calling Nawaz Sharif for his swearing-in ceremony. Also reached out to China because he had visited China a number of times when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, and also extended the hand of friendship to Xi Jinping, calling him immediately, inviting him to India in 2014, within 6 months of his taking over as Prime Minister. So his initial efforts were towards friendship, towards maintaining peace and tranquility in relationship with China particularly, if not so much with Pakistan. But when both kind of turned around and betrayed him, Pakistan on the LOC, and Xi Jinping on the very day that when he was sitting on a swing with Prime Minister Modi in Ahmedabad, sent in 1,000 PLA troops in Chumur in September 2014. I think the realization had started dawning on the Indian decision makers right at that moment, that the Chinese cannot be trusted. They will say one thing and do quite another. And therefore, if you see over the past 5 or 6 years, the infrastructure building or the infrastructure construction all along the line of actual control and in Arunachal Pradesh, across Sikkim, Uttarakhand, and particularly Ladakh, had picked up pace. There was a cohesiveness in the way the infrastructure was being built, and the kind of decisions that were being taken. To be fair, this policy was reversed in 2008 during the UPA 1 regime, but they couldn't get it really implemented. And the implementation has been superb in the past 5-6 years, and it's only going to speed up further. So that is one reason why the Chinese did not want, they know that they have a window of at least another couple of years before adequate infrastructure is built along the line of actual control on the Indian side. And therefore they wanted to disrupt that momentum that has happened over the past 5 or 6 years. That's reason number one. Reason number two is that the Chinese sort of use this playbook of signaling without getting into a full fight. I'm saying this because when I speak to the military leadership and people who are on the ground in Ladakh, they're quite surprised that the Chinese deployments are done out in the open, quite easy to pick up by India's ISR capabilities, by the satellites, by the surveillance that is mounted. They're moving artillery guns and tanks and BMPs quite openly in broad daylight. They are parking their combat air jets in Hotan and Angari and other places out in the open, not a wartime kind of a deployment, but basically to display and show off the kind of platforms and equipment that they have. So if they had any serious intent of launching a full-fledged attack or offensive, this wouldn't have happened. That doesn't mean that India is not ready or India is not taking any precautions. As I said, India's mirror deployment, as it is being called in single quotes, mirror deployment, has certainly surprised the Chinese. The speed with which India has deployed, and if need be, I can tell you with some amount of confidence and information that the Indians are prepared to wait out the winter if this crisis does not get resolved in the next couple of months. And therefore, it's going to be a long haul, both for the Chinese and the Indians on the border. But the Indians are more habituated and more acclimatized to stay at those heights and those altitudes rather than the Chinese who always go back to their barracks after having come to Aksai Chin and exercise there and have now got deployed at those altitudes. So therefore, it's going to be a game of patience, a game of, I would say, outwitting each other in terms of military tactics, if not strategy. And India, I think, is prepared now to face any ingress or any incursion all along the LAC, not just in Ladakh, but in Sikkim and in Arunachal Pradesh. And I think the Chinese have, as I said earlier, overplayed their hand, have managed to really put India in a position where they have no choice but to respond militarily if push comes to shove in the next 2 or 3 months.
Thanks, Nitin. I think you covered very well on the how India is prepared, particularly on the mirror deployment side of it. Also, aspect of how Modi ji had extended both the warm hand to Pakistan and China, but had this setbacks. It is. I would like to hear from Jeff and Walter that what do they think about India's handling about this crisis, particularly at one end, Modi ji avoided direct and reference to China many times and also avoided provocative statements. They were very carefully drafted, whether it was in all party meetings or even in Ladakh, while he challenged that or said that expansionist approach would not work, development oriented would work, but he tried to be very careful in trading with China. But at the same time, military wise, gave the free hand and started ramping up both troops and guns and air support. So everything was lining up. So what do you think about the handling of crisis from India side, Jeff and Walter?
Well, maybe just a brief comment on that. You know, the hindsight is 2020, and obviously the way to have affected a much different outcome would have been to identify this at the outset and prevent the Chinese from moving to these forward positions and in particular seizing the gray zone at Ladakh. Obviously, deterring that up front would have been the ideal outcome. But that didn't happen. The Chinese gained a significant first mover advantage at Pangong Lake and near the LAC in other areas. And at that point, I think India was put in a fairly difficult position. I don't think it had many good options beside stand your ground, make sure that there are no more incursions elsewhere, and seek to negotiate some kind of withdrawal. And of course, prepare your defenses and improve your intelligence capabilities to make sure this doesn't happen again. Beyond that, you know, there are risky options available to India to try and evict the Chinese forces from their current positions, to try and grab land elsewhere and then trade and barter for mutual withdrawals. But both of those carry significant costs and risks. And I think, at least for now, the position that India has adopted has won it significant international sympathy. Nobody views India as the aggressor on this crisis, quite the opposite. This is just another continued pattern of Chinese territorial aggression, as it's doing elsewhere. And so in terms of sort of winning the international narrative, I think this is probably India's strongest play, to look like the more responsible, more mature party that is suffering at the hands of Chinese aggression, while bolstering your capabilities and making sure this doesn't happen again, while imposing asymmetric costs on China, whether it's economic costs, whether it's market access, and while strengthening your strategic position vis-a-vis China by a stronger partnership with the US, a stronger partnership with the Quad, the acquisition of new military capabilities, the adjustment of your positions along the LAC. And so, you know, if we, again, hindsight is 2020, but once the Chinese had made their first move, I think there were not a lot of optimal alternatives and options for India. And it's probably playing the best hand it has right now.
Walter, do you want to comment?
Yeah, in terms of what will India do, I think the first thing it needs to do is to organize a commission similar to that was organized by the President External Affairs Minister's father, K. Subramaniam, who studied, you know, the issue between India and Pakistan, and how Pakistanis were able to seep through those hills above the main road connecting Srinagar to the outside. And, you know, a lot of things happened in that study that revealed real weaknesses in Indian intelligence and forward basing. I think that has to happen again. I think there needs to be a very prominent person chosen to lead a study, because, you know, India was caught flat-footed. Why wasn't Indian intelligence aware of what was happening? Why weren't the troops prepared at the border to resist? There were real weaknesses here, as there was in the earlier case between India and Pakistan. And I think you need a high-powered commission to go into that. Could be politically embarrassing, you know, to many of the leaders because of weaknesses that were held. But it was a complete failure of the intelligence in India as to what was happening, and the degree of Chinese support for that. And I think that needs to be looked at with the intention of upgrading Indian intelligence, and also a more sophisticated use of equipment at and troops at the border. I think that will happen because I think there's a lot of public pressure. And I have to give you an anecdote here. My wife is Indian, has a factory, and she's in India right now. She tells me that her workers, who normally don't discuss politics very much, are talking a lot about this, and the anti-Chinese sentiment, she says, among her workforce is really palpable. That this has really, you know, reached down in the Indian population, fury, and the notion that 20 soldiers were killed, you know, is, you know, makes them equally furious. One of our workers said, "I'm insisting my son go into the army and do his duty." So I think you have a general sense in the country that, you know, that India has to resist. I don't think the Chinese expected that. And it may be because of the way that their system of reporting is, that, you know, things are filtered through the party. And so I'm not sure the leadership truly knows what the reaction is in the various countries that they have to deal with. And that's a weakness, a huge weakness that the Chinese have in their reporting system. But I think what India is doing now is, you know, I think, you know, it seems to be building up, you know, its potential at the border, also, you know, in terms of troops and that sort of thing. But more needs to be done. A really thorough, and I think this is the most important thing, a thorough analysis, high-level analysis of what went wrong. Something went wrong.
Nitin, do you have any insight on any kind of commission or any rational or not rational? We cannot give rational to the intelligence failure, but was there an intelligence failure, or it was a because of the coronavirus, winters coming to summer? That's regularly, typically, troops go back during the winter, come back. What was the uh, happening around that?
I think I think I don't think the Indian government is looking at this as an intelligence failure, even if there are views like has been expressed here, because the information that the Chinese are doing exercises in Aksai Chin or near Aksai Chin, and the fact that they are capable of coming those 200 kilometers to the LAC was well known. What perhaps can be termed a lapse or a shortcoming was to read the intention. The capability was always known. To read the intention was, I think, not very up to the mark really. And the moment the deployment was noticed along the line of actual control in early May, I think enough precautions and enough steps were taken to respond to that. What perhaps needs to be done here is that after this crisis is over, whenever it gets over, is to have fixed accountability on who should have or fix kind of responsibility rather than accountability. Who should have what kind of responsibility to monitor the Chinese movement in Aksai Chin and otherwise. There was no failure in terms of responding to the Chinese deployment, but certainly in reading the intentions of the Chinese. Everyone knew that the Chinese are exercising in April in that area. They come every year, but because there was no intelligence or ISR capabilities to look at it every hour or maybe every day, I think there was a failure or a lapse in anticipating the sudden move that the Chinese did. So perhaps there is a need for room for improvement there. But I don't think anybody is thinking in terms of a commission like the case of Subramanian committee in the post Kargil. Short answer.
Thanks. Actually, we have a lot of things to discuss, particularly on the military preparedness you had mentioned, but I will skip that discussion. But you were right in a sense that we know that behind all these front points, there are base camps supporting that, and there are troops positioned over there. Even in the Galwan region, 9 kilometers from that, there is a base camp. But what is significant is that because lack of that intention, within 1 month, the Chinese army constructed Galwan River almost pretty good road, riverside road, reaching to the FP14. So that was a very surprising, and that happened after everything was noticed. It was not happened before. So within that 1 month, when the discussions and all that thing is going on, they pretty much tried to build up, even stop the water flow for some time, build the bridge, and then constructed the road, etc. Anyway, let's keep that aside. Good to see that India has very much prepared and have the mirror deployment. So also reading that the winter preparation is going on. So we are, I think the troops, they are going to be doubling the whole ration and the winter supplies in that region. So since Jeff and Walter both are here, and also a lot of people ask the question about what is the US role, right, in this. We saw that the Quad war plays were in action. Also, US sent USS Nimitz and USS Reagan into the South China Sea. Is US going to see this in the localized in the South China Sea, or would ever be much more direct participants? There were also some of the comments by ex-advisor of President Trump that US will never participate in Indochina, of course, directly, but there was also But at the same time, the Secretary of State Pompeo's statements are much more that against the Chinese strategy, getting directly involved or upping the whole military establishment. So we are much more interested to see that how US would US means not just the president, but US as an establishment, irrespective of presidents. What are we going to expect? Would US will only be looking at it as a strategic, tactical in the Indo-Pacific region, or just to supply the army or the military equipments, etc., or it is much more broader play US would like to have in this?
Let me start that because I made a point of that in my prepared comments to the group. I think the United States is going to stay engaged. In fact, the most common question I get, both from contacts in India as well as others outside of India, is to what extent will the U.S. remain committed to India? I think it will, and it's beyond just India, because what's happening is a larger strategic push, I think, by China to assert itself in the larger East Asian region. That pushes up against American interests. And as long as that pushes up against American interests, you're going to have an American response and support for countries who are similarly affected, of which India is one. So in fact, you can see that in the comments of Secretary of State Pompeo just a few days ago at the US-India summit. I mean, he said things that I was quite surprised that he would openly say about support of India. And you find this in the Democratic Party. As I mentioned, this is one issue in which Republicans and Democrats seem to be on the same playbook. And so, even if Biden were to win, I think you would have a similar situation, in part because the Chinese are pushing themselves in ways that the US finds to be disagreeable. In fact, some of you may have been reading some of the reports of Chinese think tanks that Mr. Ronaday has been putting out in the email. Fascinating. If you haven't, you should take a look at them. Because one of the things that seems to come out is, at least among the think tank types, is that, the Chinese, in terms of international prestige, are probably at the lowest level they've been in years. And they're going to have to be wary. But the system of government there is a bubble. To be quite frank, the think tank types don't have all that much influence. Newspapers have virtually none. And it's difficult to find out what the public is really thinking unless it's something that's really egregious happening. So, to what extent will they, and I think that's true in terms of Chinese diplomatic reporting as well. You're dealing in something of a bubble here. And Xi Jinping has a notion of China must return to the status that it once was. As I mentioned, many of my colleagues in the international relations field at Tongji would, argue in discussions, U.S. has a hegemonic position in Western Hemisphere. China should have the same in East Asia. You should recognize that we are the strongest power, and that's not going to change. Now, on the latter, it may be true. China may increasingly be a powerhouse in Asia. And so what are the likely responses to that? One is the US is likely to stay engaged in Asia because of that, the threat from China and pushing. I don't see the present Chinese government in any fundamental way changing its stance and its goal. And I can tell you it's a genuinely popular goal in China. The notion that, after a century of being, insulted and humiliated, we must get away from this. We must assert ourselves again, must never let this happen again. And one way to do that is to have a preeminent position in East Asia. And it's problematic whether any of its neighbors, even Russia, is going to accept that, because much of what is now, the far reaches of Siberian Russia were once at least under some measure of connection to the Chinese Empire. And so they have to be concerned. In fact, I'm fairly reliably informed that they are concerned about an aggressive China, what it means for them. Now, the important question is to what extent the various countries cooperate. The movement of the Quad is an interesting motion. What the Philippines have done recently is another. I think, you may have the Chinese step back a bit, catch their breath, but I don't see them giving up at all, which means I think that the American position is probably going to remain as supportive of India as it is now. Obviously, there's going to be an effort to prevent war, but I think the best way to prevent war is to make sure that the Chinese know that the other side, in this case India, is prepared to resist any kind of incursion.
Jeff, what is your view on the US role? Is there any?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Walter said. The U.S. direct role, is somewhat limited by the fact that India has always been clear that it doesn't want to be a treaty partner of the U.S. So this isn't a case where the U.S. can say this is aggression against one of our treaty allies and we need to step in and support. It's also been limited by the fact that the Indian government has quite frequently requested that the US government not take a active diplomatic role when China and India are embroiled in disputes. They have often asked the US to remain quiet in the public diplomacy arena and provide private support, but not to turn this into a US-China issue. That's changed a bit during this crisis. We have seen much more public commentary from US officials on the LAC standoff. But the amount that the US can do in situations like this is limited by our relationship with India and the restrictions that India has imposed on the relationship. Now, even with those restrictions, we do still have a lot of room for cooperation. And from all accounts, there has been fairly high levels of intelligence sharing going on behind the scenes during the entire crisis on Chinese troop movements and intentions and so forth. And so from a practical standpoint, that really does matter. If you talk to Indian security forces and Indian national security establishment, they will tell you that intelligence cooperation, not only this time, but during the Doklam crisis, during recent crises in the Indian Ocean, Chinese adventures in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, intelligence cooperation between the two countries has been improving and has proven quite beneficial for India. And so I expect that to continue. I expect the diplomatic support internationally to continue, particularly if the Indian government becomes more open to that and encouraging of the US to take a more activist diplomatic stance. And I expect the military cooperation and interoperability to continue to strengthen, as we have now signed most of these foundational enabling agreements. I think most people expect the last one, Becca, to be signed maybe at some point later this year. We do now have the grounds to share encrypted communications equipment with each other, to refuel each other's ships at sea and so forth. So we have laid the foundation and the groundwork to be more sort of operationally aligned when these crises crop up in the future. But for now, I think the most valuable contribution has been this intelligence sharing behind the scenes.
Thank you, Jeff. I think as you pointed that it's kind of paradigm shift right now at the military level and the policy level, also how the both nations would look at this and take the future direction. It would be very important retrospection for the strategist would be doing, and definitely we'll see the further actions. Nitin has extensively covered that how the India's military establishment is actually building the infrastructural development, etc. But with the interest of time, we actually almost ended our allotted time, but we could not cover the questions. I can pick up a few important which were not covered as a part of our discussions. Many of the questions were actually got covered one way or another. We have, Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, he mentioned a couple of interesting ideas, and then we have Silicon Valley-based entrepreneur and venture capitalist Venk Shukla. He asked about that how India can incur cost on China, whether it is economically or raising the Tibet. The Tibet issue came from multiple other questions as well, and Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, he raised UNSC seat, etc. But most importantly, whether there can be a quad-like exercise in Ladakh region, which probably Nitin can address. So I'm just covering the questions, but I will just now keep it open. In your final comments, Walter, Jeff, and Nitin, if you can touch base, each of you can take, say, a couple of minutes and see which aspect you can cover in the few minutes so that we can wrap up in next 10 minutes. Thanks.
Should I go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Would you like me to say something?
Yeah. So
Okay.
each one of you can do a couple of minutes final comments. In that comments, if you can touch base any of the question of what you feel important, those people has raised,
Right.
but don't have to limit the questions I read. It can be anything from the chat.
Right. So my final comments are these that we are, as I said, and I'm going to repeat one sentence that the old normal is gone. It has vanished. We'll have to look for a new normal, and India has to be prepared. And not just India. I think United States and India are on the same page when it comes to tackling China. But let me also say this at the cost of repetition again. I think Jeff said this or somebody else said this. I think Walter said or even I said it earlier, that India will deal with China bilaterally when it comes to border negotiations and the boundary negotiations there. Whenever the negotiations take place, there India does not need help or does not want any help from a third country, and that is how it should be because. After all, only India has the long 4,000 nearly 4,000 kilometer long, contested and undemarcated border. Nobody else has to face that kind of a blowback as India does. So I think India will have to deal with China on its own when it comes to boundary negotiations. But in the background, all these other cooperative mechanisms like Quad. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying the Quad can invite Vietnam and Indonesia to join their exercises and maybe even some of the other mechanisms to put pressure on China in South China Sea and Malacca Straits, especially their passage to Indian Ocean. That can be done, and India has to, of course, improve its ISR capabilities, its infrastructure in Andamans, for instance, which has to be used much more strategically than just concentrating on the Himalayan border, which is extremely important and sensitive. But Andaman needs to be also brought into the equation, the Andaman Nicobar group of islands. And finally, I think India has no option but to reduce its dependency on the supply chains from China in various sectors, which has already started in a manner that China probably did not expect. And if this can be carried through, and I've had a discussion with some of the leading telecom players, for instance, the other day, almost an hour, we discussed this. And it's an Indian indigenous telecom network, an Indian Huawei, if you want to describe it as, it's on its way. And perhaps that is an indication how India is going to handle the China challenge going forward and not depend on China, not allow China to make inroads into various sensitive sectors. I think that is where the future lies as far as India and China is concerned. I'll end the comments here. Thank you.
But my only request would be, let's not call it an Indian Huawei. Let's call it an let's call it an Indian Verizon or an Indian AT&T.
Indian Geo, if you want to call it.
Yeah, Indian.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'll pick up here since I butted in anyway, and we'll save the best for last with Walter. I'll just address very briefly. You mentioned a quad military exercise in Ladakh. I think for now that's probably a bridge too far, considering that we haven't even done a Quad naval exercise yet, or since 2007, I think it's much more likely we would see, Australian participation in Malabar before we saw a Quad exercise in Ladakh. India has traditionally been quite sensitive about bringing in foreign militaries to do engagements in Ladakh. I mean, I had a hard enough time going in there myself when I traveled to the region and went up to Pangong Lake. I do think, though, if we want to get creative and think about things, there is a series of U.S.-India joint military exercises, joint army exercises that have been taking place for many years now. I don't see a reason why at some point in the future there couldn't be a mountain warfare training exercise. I think it would more likely be India-U.S. rather than a multilateral exercise. But maybe even before that, you begin to look at creative exercises around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, naval exercises around this strategic gold mine that India has in the Indian Ocean. And it would be nice to see India become more comfortable operating with the US and like-minded partners in the naval arena in the eastern part of the Indian Ocean. I think those are logical next steps. But I don't see why a joint India-US Army exercise in Ladakh or somewhere near the Himalayan border regions isn't possible at some point. The only thing I'll say on Tibet, this is frankly another very long discussion, detailed, complex, can't be covered in a minute or two here. But one thing that it has always made me fundamentally uncomfortable to give the Chinese a veto over who we interact with. As an American, that is offensive to me, that the Chinese leadership could tell the US president, you can meet this person, you can't meet that person, you will be punished if you speak with the Dalai Lama. And the US has had a history of US presidents, sometimes reluctantly, meeting with the Dalai Lama. I don't believe that's happened yet during the Trump administration. I would have liked to have seen that, and I hope that continues with whoever's elected. But I also hope that the Indians at least don't necessarily engage with the Tibetans specifically to provoke China, but also don't let China dictate to them who they can speak to, who can hold an event or a rally inside Delhi. I think they should engage with the Tibetans on their own terms. They should engage with the Dalai Lama on their own terms. And if that's occasionally high-profile meetings or events, then that's fine. China certainly doesn't check with India every time it has an engagement with Pakistan. Every time it wants to build a road in Kashmir or sell Pakistan a nuclear reactor. And I don't think that India needs to be so deferential to Chinese sensitivities when it comes to the Tibetan exile community, particularly in the current environment.
Then definitely many people would like your view how India should deal basically the Tibet issue. Walter, you want to conclude your thoughts?
Well, let me carry on with the security issues that Jeff just talked about. On security, other people have mentioned that. I noticed several of the questions have referred to what I'm about to say. I don't think the U.S. and India should have any kind of security alliance. I think that works to the strategic disadvantage of India. As I mentioned, I think one reason why the Chinese, well, I know this, one of the major Chinese fears is a closer U.S.-India relationship, but that kind of concern only exists when there isn't an alliance, when you pass the barrier. And I think what the Chinese very much don't want is India to move incrementally closer. Well, it is because of its action, but I think it would be a mistake to have any kind of alliance system. And I don't think in the Indian political context that would be agreed to in any case. I think there can be very close relations. And I think, intelligence sharing, which actually goes back much further than we've talked about here, could be stepped up as well, and to everyone's advantage. in terms of, what the government can do, the Indian government can do, I think, it's unlikely the Indian government is going to push the Chinese out of those areas where they don't want to leave. I mean, you can negotiate, but how far that will get. But what they can do is they can strengthen their positions along the line of actual control and the Indian claims along the line of control to make sure it doesn't happen again, and to let the Chinese know that they're not willing to put up with this again. And I think that would, be a great help, and also improved intelligence about what the Chinese are doing. And I suspect that there are, Indian capabilities to develop that as well, and certainly in cooperation with the U.S. and others who are equally concerned about what the Chinese are doing. There's, in terms of that, a close friend of mine who is an ambassador from another country in India tells me he is absolutely amazed at the degree to which Indian, from his perspective and his various consulates, the Indian popular sentiment regarding China has changed, and also in a certain sense regarding itself and its own security. And I think he's right. That's been my impression as well. And I think this gives the government a lot of room for maneuver in deciding what it plans to do about the border, about China and other things, and about its neighbors, which I think it needs to take. It needs to develop efforts to develop a closer relationship with its neighbors, because few parts of the world are as disconnected as the countries of South Asia. And I think that has to happen. But I think they'll stop short of any kind of treaty alliance, because I think that's not strategically wise, and I don't think it would play well in India as well.
Thank you, Walter. I would like to invite Admiral Shekhar Sinha, who is one of the FIDS expert, and he's dialing from India. So, Admiral Shekhar Sinha, can you conclude, because a lot of this concluding discussion also went into South China Sea, where we will be on the topic, we'll be having subsequent talk. If you're around, please do the concluding comments.
Yeah, thank you, Khanderaji. I'm very much here attending your Discord this evening. Firstly, thank you very much, Walters, Jeff, and Nitin, for honestly a very wide exposition of this entire LAC issue which is going on. First, I just want to give you one breaking news that the Chinese researcher who was hiding in San Francisco consulate has been arrested and should be produced in front of the CA Eastern District Court tomorrow. I think Nitin was quite right in saying that we have not been able to read the intentions of the Chinese. There are a lot of dots which need to be joined before you come to some strategic calculation. So there, I think, is there has been a shortcoming. For example, yesterday, China's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs has officially gifted 12 agricultural spraying drones to Pakistan Ministry of National Food Security and Research. I would firmly believe that these are the real-time camera drones which will fly over Siachen, and they will keep giving the the map of the entire area and what's happening, because it is quite possible that we haven't talked about China Pakistan coming together. That's a different subject by itself, which I've heard Jeff speaking on various forums. It's a long issue. The CCPs probably has come to conclusion that it's time to arrive on the world stage has come, which Nitin rightly said that it is probably a decade too early. And therefore, all these things are happening. They are controlling the pandemic, and they are doing a Hong Kong, they are doing Taiwan, they are doing a South China Sea, and now they are doing India. So that is one of the larger strategic interests, to get the US out of that position. Second one, as far as the India-US naval cooperation, Khanderaji is specifically addressing what you said. The Malabar exercise started in 1992 between the US Navy and the Indian Navy. To be honest, it was much to dislike of the Foreign Office, our MEA at that time. But finally they reconciled and realized that Navy was looking forward or looking ahead of the time. And now, this Indo-Pacific construct, there was a lot of fog in the beginning. and you saw Indo-Pacific construct depending upon where you were located on the map. The Indians saw it differently, the Japanese and the Australians, everybody was seeing it differently, and China was certainly viewing it with suspicion. And because of China, it was Russia who made an open statement, the foreign minister. But of course, he has not been making those statements anymore because of the equation and the foreign minister having explained to them as to what it is. So now the fog is clearing quite a lot, and now we know what the extent of this Indo-Pacific going to be, and how this, the security construct or the after pandemic new world order is going to look like. Because India was very careful. Prime Minister Modi in Shangri-La did not mention the name of China. He said it is all inclusive. But I think probably this 15 June incident would have changed his opinion. However, you mentioned, Walters, you mentioned about Prime Minister Modi's address to the business forum, the US-India business forum, quite right. But in the same forum, Walters, the foreign minister also mentioned that the US has to go beyond the, the narrative of alignment, and you have to learn to deal with the multilateralism. And that's a very important statement he has made. I, for one, have been saying this for a long time, and one of the podcast of Nitin, which just happened a day ahead of what the foreign minister, our external affairs minister, had to say. So I think that that is one issue that I wanted to bring out here, because that doesn't seem to have come. US has really, is drawing China towards the sea, and not that China does not realize. If you see the 2015 military strategy paper, China has mentioned very clearly the thought that supremacy on land is all pervasive, needs to be abandoned. The prosperity of the nation lies overseas, and therefore China will build its PLA, the CCP Navy, I would like to call the CCP Navy, reach out to all areas of interest, and that will always be backed by the Chinese Navy, by the PLA Navy. So that is an important part to remember, that China may have done this on a land border, but ultimate intention will be to test the strength of these people at sea. And therefore the exercise with the aircraft carrier Nimitz and Australia's inclusion, hopefully, as Jeff has said, into the Malabar, are all indication in that direction that it will be a fairly cooperative arrangement. Now somebody says, how can you have without an alignment? Let me tell you, in the Navy and Navy alone, there is a system of having a commander task force. Depending upon where is the excursion into military regime overseas, and that country will probably lead the combined task force to counter the Chinese move. So this is very clear. As far as Navy is concerned, it is not an outlandish thought. We always do that. In fact, in 2007, when we had a 5-country Malabar exercise, I was the fleet commander of Western Fleet, and I was the officer in tactical command for one of the exercises. So, it is not, this is a very done thing so as I said, the fog is getting very, very clear. And I agree with everything that everybody has said. But the broader angle is that we cannot forget the China-Pakistan nexus. We have to be very careful. Pakistan has been told to keep quiet for the time being, but I see that's not going to happen for too long. Intelligence sharing is now happening. You can see this, drones being handed over to the Pakistanis yesterday. So thank you very much. I have really, been quite very educative and very enriching listening to our 3 panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Shekhar Sinha, for concluding this panel. I will hand over to Kiran to vote of thanks. We'll be having 2 more sessions in the next month. One is about the CPEC, another is on CAA, and the third possibly with Admiral Shekhar Sinha's presence, we can do South China Sea as well. So Kiran, are you there?
Yes, Kandaraji, I'm still here.
Yeah.
So thanks for Dr. Andersen Thanks, Dr. Jeff, and thanks, Nitin Gokhale, for having this session. This was really enlightening. And thanks for taking your time to answer all of the questions at the end. Thanks, Admiral Sinha ji. You are here in our conferences most of the time, and we are really grateful to have you on our conferences. And we'll circulate the next schedule of conferences as Mr. Khanderao has mentioned. I thank FIDS for having this conference, and I announce this session to be closed.